Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight as we discuss the tunnels of Vietnam War on the Lessons of Vietnam show, which is watched all around the world. The Lessons of Vietnam show is broadcast from the studio of Nissan Communications. They are gracious to give us the chance to tell the real story of the Vietnam War and those who served in Vietnam and those who served wherever they were located. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 1967-68 at Long Bend Post. I am a member of the North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated, Vice President of Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 530, and a member of the Board of Directors of North Carolina Vietnam Veterans of America. I'm a Commander of American Legion Post 297 and a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And so I've got a little bit of experience here. Your participation in the show is always encouraged and appreciated. And if you see there on the screen, you can see how to get in touch with us. For comments, suggestions, you go to 919-518-9773 and ask your questions or make your comments or whatever. When Amnon answers the phone, or even better, go to Computer's 2K Voice and tell us what you think about the show. If you know anything about the tunnels or whatever, come in and talk to us about it. We always, as I said, encourage everybody to take part in the show. Always with the 22 veterans a day committing suicide, we always want to make sure we get this information out. If you know someone who needs to talk to someone, give them these numbers. If somebody mans it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I guess in leap year it'd be 66, but anyway, that's the information I want to make sure we get out. Again, I am your host, Bill Dixon, and looking forward to going over the show tonight. I have been to the tunnels we're going to be talking about. I have been there personally, and I'll reflect a little bit as we talk about those. The famous tunnels everybody knows about was the tunnels of Coochie. But we're going to be talking about some other tunnels and so forth as we go through. This kind of gives you an idea of a tunnel complex. Thanks to the tunnels, the Viet Cong guerrillas would ambush American soldiers in the jungle and disappear without a trace. You know, as we have talked about it before, the Vietnamese Viet Cong, the communists, would never fight with the Americans unless they were well outnumbered the Americans. They would maybe shoot and drop down in their holes and so forth. However, these secret tunnels were not only for fortifications for them, but they were also the center of their community life. Hidden beneath the destroyed villages inside these tunnels were underground kitchens and home camp stoves, which I'll show you in a little bit, well water, rest areas, dorms, HQ centers, that's headquarters centers, medical areas, hospitals, food and weapons supply, storage, schools, public spaces where couples could get married. And he also had traveling USO shows for the Viet Cong. As you see there, the number one, the firing post where they had a place there where the Viet Cong could pop up and shoot. Number two is the airtight door. In other words, if you dropped a gas grenade or something down in there, it wouldn't go any farther than right there because of the trap door. They used to try to pump gas in, nerve gas, not nerve gas, but tear gas. Yeah, that stuff that burns your eyes. So they pump that in there, but it wouldn't go anywhere because of the trap doors. Let's see, number three. Number three is the first aid post where they had beds there. They had doctors down in there, nurses and so forth. And quite often they would have someone on a bicycle somewhere pedaling like all get out so they could have electricity in the hospital areas. Up there is area 4, the punji stake traps. If you go to the tunnels of Coochie, there are all kinds of booby traps all around. As you can see, they got a great display there. Number 5 is reinforced sleeping chambers. They would put logs and so forth on top. Let's see, number 6 would be the blast defection wall. Also, they would build them in different angles and so forth. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. There's the well where they got their drinking water out of and cooking water. Number 8 is your meeting room, dug out good and deep, and the storage catch for weapons and food. was number 9. As you see, they wanted to keep that low because they didn't want the someone to set off the stored weapons and so forth and ammunition and blow the whole tunnel up. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of example of what they were. We're going to go into them a little bit more as we go. The hung cam stove. That's the stove right there. And we were just looking at it, and it looks like it's concrete, but I believe that's just the way the earth is down in there. I have been to the tunnels, as you saw a while ago, that I don't fit in, even though they have made the tunnels wider for tourists. There was no way I was going to go down in there, but this is the stove, and the Ho Cam stove, named after its inventor, a Viet Minh soldier in 1951, was a stove intake and chimney system which diffused and dissipated smoke from cooking, which prevented aerial detection of smoke by American military planes that were used extensively in the Coochie tunnels and other hideouts. Another name for the cooker was guitar stove. The system required a deep, covered hole in the ground from which long underground bamboo vents dissipated the smoke. And because the smoke came out, it didn't rise up high. It stayed close to the ground inside the jungles and so forth. But in some parts of the network, there were even theaters where performers entertained people with songs, dance, and traditional stories. The most vital part of any tunnel, the ventilation holes, were hidden at the foot of trees, thick grass, or termite nest. In order to keep the tunnels from collapsing, the VCs used woods from the jungle and iron stolen from U.S. Army bases to reinforce the tunnels. Now, if you look at that picture right there, you see the log. Right at the bottom of the log is a ventilation shaft. It's probably only about 2 inches deep or deep. And you walking through the jungle, it would be hard to find out there, but that they had all those out there. This is breathing hole to the tunnels in the space under logs at Long Funk. There's one at a termite hill. I was thinking it was an ant, but that's a termite. As you can see, there another air vent there to get the tunnels some air. I'm certain it didn't get a lot of air. You can see some of the larger rooms in the tunnels. There's the stove and dining hall. So they could get rooms pretty good and fit what they needed. Vietnam tunnels were dug well before the war actually started. That was the Vietnam-American War. While the war began in 1955, the tunnels began being dug by communist forces in the mid to late 1940s, with renovations occurring to tunnels already dug in the early 1960s. Tunnels were dug anywhere and everywhere in South Vietnam. As you can see, that one, there's a concealed entrance under a hut, a cooking pot. So if the Americans would come into the village, they'd look around and couldn't find anything. But if they take the ashes and move that cooking pot, they'd have the entrance to the tunnels. And as you can see off on your side there with the water, they actually had tunnels that you could go down in the water and come up out of the water into the tunnels. The air vents hidden in the bushes, underwater entrance. So they were pretty ingenious with their tunnels and so forth. Now, during the Vietnam War, the system was continuously expanded and upgraded to a 250-kilometer system with 3 levels of tunnels, 6 meters, 8 meters, and 10 meters deep and underground. During the day, the peasants farmed on the fields, but when the sun set, they started excavating the tunnels. As you can see, there is a village in South Vietnam. It has the tunnels going down. You see the well, and you see the chambers where they kept their weapons and all started. But that was in quite a few of the villages in South Vietnam. In the beginning, for security reasons, each village dug their own separate tunnels, and nobody knew where the tunnels of other villages were. So each village. Now, if you see there, you have a moat. Observation posts are surrounded by mines. You have a shaft there. If you see, the shaft goes on down beyond the tunnel entrance, and at the bottom of that shaft is probably punji sticks sticking up, which I'll tell you a little bit about as we go. But it could have been a snake down in there tied, cobra, or some of the other snakes that tied off down there. So if you drop down, it would would get the American soldier. See the mines, booby trapped, the strong point there, uh, ditch with punji sticks in it. But that was for a typical village. Now, there's some Viet Cong digging the tunnel. Some of the tunnels are even under the river. The design of the tunnels is zigzag, which serves as a link between villages and made it hard for the enemy to explore and travel inside the system. Dust and soil was spread out carefully by being dumped in bomb craters or the river or out in the fields. So you can see how they're digging right there. They didn't have any backhoes or bobcats or anything. It was all dug by hand, as we'll talk about. Now this kind of gives you an idea. The patches themselves were not cut in dead straight lines. Rather, they were made with corners that had between 60 and 120 degrees angle to them. In other words, the corners were constructed with no less than a 60-degree angle and no more than a 120-degree angle. This made shooting in a straight line impossible and helped to deflect explosive blasts from grenades that might be thrown down. So if you threw a grenade down, if it got by the trap door, it still wouldn't affect the rest of part of the tunnel. Most of the time, guerrillas would spend the day in the tunnels working or resting and come out only at night to scavenge for supplies, tend their crops, or engage in the enemy in battle. Then they'd drop back down in the hole and we'd look around and go, where did they go? Tunnel construction was rather crude. There was not enough ventilation. As you can see, the ventilating from other slides we've shown you, the ventilation holes were not big, especially if you had a lot of tunnels. Vietnam has a wet tropical climate. The tunnels were hot, humid. The air was hard to breathe. Sanitation was poor. I'm surprised you didn't even call it poor. Poisonous animals, most insects thrived in the shafts. Sickness was rampant among the people living in the tunnels, especially malaria, which was the second largest cause of death next to battle wounds. Almost everyone had intestinal parasites of significance. And there's another pictures of the is drawn by the Americans or the Australians, kind of showing you how the tunnels work. Number one, there was the air vents and how they could pop up and so forth. So this is what they dug them with. They took a long bamboo pole with a notch on it. They had their reed basket where they threw the sand in. They had the picks and the short shovels. See, a full-size shovel wouldn't work. You ever try to dig a hole and you have to so far, you can't get very far down, especially with the handle. So they had the short handle stuff and they had the tripods made out of bamboo, which they could lower down and get the basket filled up with dirt and raise it back up and go dump it someplace. Each tunnel digging team, typically it consisted of 3 men. First 2 teams dug 2 dry wells. As you can see there, one dry well has been filled up. About 10 meters apart from each other. These dry wells were shafts from the surface down to 3 to 5 meters. Once reaching the required depth, the 2 teams would dig towards each other underground and then downward, which may be another reason why the zigzag started out, because 2 guys digging from one end and 2 guys digging from the other end, our chances of them coming out to the same spot are slim to none. But that's how they dug. 2 men digging with 1 man up the top with the dirt. And they dig until they meet, then they move down and dig another dry well and start the process all over again and fill in the dry well as they went. There's the dry well, and you see the men digging. And each team, 1 man dug, another shoveled the earth into the baskets, then took them to dry well where the other team member was waiting to haul the baskets up to the ground. Each dry well had to be filled after it had been dug. Don't you know that took a long, drawn-out affair to build those things? Thousands of tons of earth would haul from the underground tunnels to the surface. Where did VC hide it? They couldn't just pile up a freshly dug earth into high, large mounds. I mean, that'd be easy. We could be walking along, go, why you got all this dirt here? Instead, the earth was made into house basements, furs for farming, or banks for communications and combat trenches. Sometimes it was poured into streams and nearby rivers, which may be why all the rivers and streams in Vietnam were brown. but never left in heaped mounds. If U.S. bombs hit somewhere near the tunnel sites, the VC would simply shovel the earth into a new bomb crater. Sometimes they loaded the earth into carts and had water buffaloes pull the carts away from the tunnel sites to dispose of it elsewhere. They would load up one of their little carts and the water buffalo, which hated Americans anyway, and they'd go fill in the bomb craters. Now, around the Ho Chi Minh Trail where it went, it was a lot of that going in to fill so they could keep the road open. Tunnel digging. This is a picture that I took of the basket and the pick there, you see. Looks like a pickaxe with one side off. But I took that picture to give you an idea what the basket. The shaft was called a dry well because it looked like that way, a well with no water. VCs in the Coochie area had studied carefully the geology of the area and knew that Coochie was about 12 to 15 meters above sea level. There was certainly no water for the first 6 meters down, and the water table was usually found at about 10 to 15 meters. It was just perfect for tunneling. You didn't want to dig down to the water table because the tunnel would flood, and you didn't particularly want the tunnel to flood. The tunnels of Coochie. I'm kind of hitting on the high spots tonight because there's no way I can tell you all of it. So you might want to get this book, The Tunnels of Coochie, and read it. Highly recommend. I try to encourage you to go out and read the books as much as possible. The real security for the tunnel system depended on the precise and cunning use of camouflage. Tom Mango's book, The Tunnels of Coochie, cited a captured VC document detailing tunnel camouflage techniques. So if you can get this book, you can learn how to camouflage your tunnel. A Vietnamese document. From a document from a captured Viet Cong, this is what they had to say. If the duration of use of the tunnel is to be long, we should grow viable plants. In other words, if it's going to use the tunnel for a long time, rather than put leaves there, which are going to die and turn brown, you put fresh plants in there and you grow them because they keep right on going. Change dried leaves before they get dark and blot out all suspicious traces before daybreak. Give a contrast to the camouflage by using high and low plants. Sound like you got a subdivision entrance going here. Do not show a dull and prominent heap of earth. Plants and branches must be picked far from the fortifications and the troops' locations. When an emergency repair is necessary, never pick up branches and leaves between the enemy and us. Especially do not gather a great number in one place. Now, that's what the Viet Cong had to say in their book, to tell them how to camouflage their trapdoors and so forth. Now, as you see it right there, that's Saigon. Bien Hoa is just up from that. You can kind of see what looks like a one there, but that's Bien Hoa. Basically, that's where I was. But if you see those markings right there, that is the markings for the different tunnels all over just one area of Vietnam. This was in 3 Corps. Location of major VC tunnels found in 3 Corps Tactical Zone up to January 1968. As you can see there, 3 Corps in Saigon and 4 Corps down south, 2 Corps, and then up. 1 Corps was up where you would know Da Nang and A Shaw Valley and Way and so forth, and then the DMC. But looking at that, that's a lot of tunnels. We could all been walking all over them and never knew it. I can't imagine that many different tunnels, but especially now, the biggest blob you see is right around Coochie. Now, life in the tunnels was extremely difficult. Air, food, and water were scarce, and the tunnels were infested with ants. And I can tell you, they had some mean ants. Poisonous centipedes, scorpions, spiders, vermin, like that rat. Like Americans, Viet Cong guerrilla fighters were not superhuman, so they were scared of these poisonous insects and bugs too. So how would you like to be crawling through a dark tunnel, knowing that somewhere in that tunnel is a good chance that you might find that green snake right there? We call him two-step. Or that millipede, which could go up to 2 feet long, the rats, the insects, those ants that were just unbelievable. They took a piece of meat out when they go. and you had to crawl through it, and people shooting at you, and bombs are dropping. It amazes me how any of them survive. But they were all also under the constant threats of American both underground and on the ground, along with continuous search and destroy operations. Random artillery was fired into the area at night, and U.S. pilots were told to drop all unused bombs and napalms there before returning to base. And that was after they found the tunnels around Coochie. They started dropping them and so forth. But it was not unusual. They would call it interdiction at night for the artillery people to just fire in an area that was a free fire zone to make sure that if there was any patrols of Viet Cong out there that they knew they had stayed in. And just being underground and knowing these bombs are coming in and just unbelievable. According to some statistic, 500,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the Coochie area during the war. 500,000, that's 500,000. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot of. Now that kind of gives you an idea of what a tunnel would look like crawling through. Except they got a little bit of light there because you can see that pipe in there. Now that's good when you can actually see yourself crawling through it. I'll tell you that. I'm getting too good at putting these together. There were times that guerrillas had to stay in the tunnels for weeks or months, laying down on the floor just to get enough air to breathe, and many even lost their consciousness or suffocated. Many had to eat stale rice, grass, or drink urine to survive. The only 6,000 or 16,000 Viet Cong guerrillas serving in Coochie survived the war. That means just in that one area, they lost 10,000 Viet Cong associated with the tunnels. And I'm going to tell you why we never found those bodies in a little bit. The VC also dragged the bodies of their dead comrades underground in order to enter them in temporary graves when it became impossible to bury them above ground due to the presence of American troops. See, if you become and go into a firefight, because the United States used body count as how you could tell whether you won or lost a battle, the Viet Cong had a big habit of picking up their dead and wounded and haul them off just so that we couldn't count them. Once they had been dragged underground, they were buried into fetal position in the tunnel walls and covered with a thin layer of clay. So you are crawling down the tunnel, and so your buddy was buried up in the wall maybe a week or so, and he's probably getting pretty ripe by then. And no wonder they had trouble breathing and so forth. But now this was the Vietnam complex, a little bit easier to see. You can see that guy crawling there in the middle, narrow passage. You can see where the firing posts are and the gun. I love that little thing that says there's a gun. I think we could probably figure that out. There's the kitchen, the ammunition dump, and there's your bicycle doing a generator so that at the first aid camp they could see. They got water. You see, there was a lot of false tunnels, and the idea was that if a American or Australian soldier or whatever was crawling down into that false tunnel, he'd fall down in the water there and probably drown and couldn't get back out, as you can see. And then you see the trap doors throughout that kept a lot of the gas and grenades and so forth from being able to get in. And there they are cooking, and they got them a well there, and lower the water, lower the bucket down to the well, and remote smoke vents. As you can see where the kitchen is, and you see where the smoke comes out there in that picture, or right just above the trapdoors, and the kitchen's back over someplace. Now this kitchen's partially out of the ground, so the jungle did fall in on them a lot. While the tunnels saved thousands of lives and provided a huge tactical advantage, they also claimed thousands of casualties, and cave-ins were a huge problem. But generally, they dug deep and supported the tunnels when they could with supporting structures. Now, this kind of gives you an idea. This was pictures I took at Coochie. Actually, that picture with the simulated Viet Cong going down in the hole was taken by someone else. But you see the hole right there. It's not very big. And then under that, can you see the trap door? It's there. It's the same trap door. You see the man going down in the hole. There's the hole. And then there at the holes after he goes underground with the leaves and so forth on it. If you look real carefully at the bottom of the picture, left-hand corner, there's kind of a yellow leaf sticking up. It looks like somebody put a check mark there, but it's not. It's a leaf. You can see the edge of the trap door. Now, you walking through the jungle, and it's hot, and the jungle's all around you. What's the chance that you're going to find that trap door? Not too well, okay? Now, the Coochie tunnel system was originally built in late 1948 or early 1949 during the Indochina War, which goes back to the French, with the aim of maintaining communication between the villages and invading French sweeps of the area. Yeah, evading. Yeah, evading. That's okay. Sometimes my contacts don't work good. The Coochie tunnels gained a strategic important role in the wars because of the location, which is only 20 miles from the center of Saigon. You can see again the Saigon there, the Coochie tunnels were there, and not too far from Benoit where I was either. The most important city in South Vietnam, of course, was Saigon. The tunnels of Coochie. In the beginning, almost every family had their own secret bunker to hide in, the Viet Minh soldiers. Now, the Viet Minh goes back to the battle with the French. However, once a separate bunker is detected by the enemy, the soldier could easily be captured or killed as he had only one way out. So, hence came the need of connecting these bunkers together so that the Vietnamese soldiers could have more chances to escape. They'd have all kinds of different holes in there, but you can see the booby traps and so forth. Okay. Amazingly, they managed to build 200 miles of tunnels in the famed Coochie district. 200 miles of tunnels, which is just 20 miles north of Saigon, and right next to the headquarters of the United States 25th Tropical Lightning Infantry Division. I believe that was the Coochie base camp was the third largest military complex in Vietnam, and they had 200 miles of tunnels right next to it and probably in it. It allowed the Viet Cong to almost be invisible. American GIs knew that the Viet Cong were hiding underground, but thought their tunnel structures were nothing more than a few dozen feet of tunnel with a single entrance, nothing more than a homemade cave with a concealed entrance. So they dropped grenades in them in order to try and block the entrance and hopefully entomb the enemy inside. Little did they know. What we're going to be talking about are tunnel rats. Those are soldiers who go down in the tunnels. I think you got to be somewhat strange to do this. I'm glad I was a bigger than average soldier. That's their non gratum annus rodent, their patch. Operation Crimp. This is where we actually found out about the tunnels. Through the 14th of January, 1966, sometimes called the Battle of Hobo Woods. I had heard of Hobo Woods, but I'd never heard of Operation Crimp. The operation made up of U.S. military forces and Australian military forces and took place 12 miles south of Coochie. The operation targeted a Viet Cong headquarters that was thought to be hidden underground and two brigades of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade. We talked about them last show. After heavy fighting and many casualties on both sides, but the two brigades did not find the extensive tunnel system that covered more than 120 miles, the ones that's looking at. Okay? Sandy McGregor, that's Sandy right there, was serving as the captain of an Australian engineering corps, and he decided the tunnels need more investigation. So he took a gun and a light and ordered his men to lower him into a tunnel by a rope he tied around his legs. Now, how'd you like to do that? You just crawl down in this hole and you're holding you by a rope around your legs. He was basically dangled into a dark pit that could be crawling with enemy and booby traps. He was the first non-Viet Cong to enter the tunnels, and he and his men spent 4 days crawling around them and were the first to document the facts that they weren't just small rooms. They were an extensive network of tunnels with living areas, weapon caches, and functional hospitals. After the Australians revealed that the tunnels on the Coochie base were much more extensive than anyone imagined, the American military realized that the beehive it was sitting on. Again, we go back to Coochie base. What the Australians discovered was a vast labyrinth of communications tunnels leading to caves, caverns built on 4 separate levels. Not one level now, 4 different levels. 12,000 Viet Cong were killed during this Coochie operation. Just Operation Crimp, they killed 12,000 Viet Cong. Okay. This kind of gives you an idea of the tunnel system that was. This is the plan that McGregor drew out. If you look carefully on it, you got the exits. There were 4 Australians killed, and let's see if I can tell you about where to find. Oh, you see that the word says suitable landing zone clearing, and there's tunnels all around it. So when the Americans were coming in, the helicopters were landing at that LZ. And at that LZ, with the bunkers coming around and the bunkers and the holes, the Viet Cong could just pop up out of the ground and shoot that helicopter and the men getting off of it as they're coming in. Now, just above that was where the Australians went in. There were 4 Australian soldiers killed at point A, and that's where they went in. But as you can see, that's what they did in the 4 days they were there going into tunnels. The tunnel width was 2 feet. The tunnel height was 2 foot 6 inches. How'd you like to crawl down a 2 foot by 2 foot 6 inch hole in the ground? The trap doors were 16 by 12. The rooms were average of 6 feet by 4 feet, 3 feet high. You want to call that a room? The tunnel depth went anywhere from 7 to 10 feet. And the beams, they used beams in the main tunnels, extraction shafts, air shafts, and so forth. So that kind of gives you an idea of what McGregor come up with when he was down in there. Now we're going to talk about how the Americans got involved in there. The American U.S. 3rd Brigade, part of the 173rd, subsequently also uncovered a significant tunnel complex after Sergeant Stuart Green from U.S. 1st to 28th Battalion accidentally sat down on a nail and uncovered a trapdoor on January 11th. That's kind of funny, unless you want to sit down on that nail. Volunteered to enter the tunnel. Green then loaded an underground dispensary, occupied more than 30 Viet Cong who subsequently escaped. But that's the Americans going down. But you couldn't see that trapdoor. He was sitting on it. Later, smoke machines we talked about a while ago was used to pump smoke into the tunnel system, and this was successful in locating numerous tunnel entrances and bunkers as the smoke rose above the jungle canopy. As they were pumping in that hole, all of a sudden you could see it coming out of other holes all around you. They were the first American troops to enter the tunnels, and they proceeded to attack them with CS gas and later explosives. However, such tactics met with limited success, with the tear gas flushing out large numbers of women and children, but very few Viet Cong. Led by Green, a squad of Americans equipped with flashlights, pistols, and a field telephone penetrated over 1 mile of tunnel systems before becoming involved in a firefight with the Viet Cong. That's even more strange, wouldn't it? Be down in that 2 foot by 2 foot hole, and you're in a firefight, and you can't hardly see them, and all you see is a muzzle flash, I guess, and flashlights. Wearing gas masks, the Americans threw gas grenades and fought their way back to the tunnel entrance, which was also a problem. How do you turn around in a 2 foot by 2 foot? But one soldier became lost in darkness, and Green had re-entered the tunnels to find him. The Viet Cong subsequently withdrew, but you can see the women and children coming out of the tunnel. The brave men who specialized in investigating the tunnels were called tunnel rats, were a rare breed. Amen to that. Listen, you got to have nerves to go down in that ground. Even if you get the bad guys in there trying to kill you, or the snakes and the other things and the traps down in there, just crawling down that hole, you got to be a bad you know what. They entered surface access holes, barely 2 feet wide. Usually they were armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a small pistol, and maybe a few grenades, and a lot of courage. The problem when you throw the grenade, the tunnel may cave in on you. Some of the tunnel entrances were designed so that in the dark, the tunnel rat would feel their way along the wall, only to fall in a pit of punchy stakes that were sharpened stakes of bamboo, often smeared with human waste. So if they did not kill you, it would have instant infection. That was sometimes almost as good or better than killing a soldier. But punchy sticks, you would take bamboo, put it in the fire, put a notch on it like a fish hook, so you can't just pull it back out, and put it in the fire so it gets hard, and then you dip it into poop, human waste, and then you stick it down in the ground. And what happened, of course, if you step on it and it goes through your boot, or you fall in on it, and even if it doesn't kill you, it ends up all those germs and so forth gets in it and infected almost immediately. The tunnel was designed small enough for only Vietnamese people, but very narrow for Americans. The entrance hole in the ground are barely wide enough for Americans, followed by a lot of U-turns, which is also how do you make that U-turn that led to the surface. Then twist again before heading off horizontally further. The tunnels were also very dark, and there was no room to turn around and retreat. Besides, booby traps were used as many as possible, not only inside the tunnels, but also on the ground around the tunnels. And I highly recommend, if you go to Vietnam, to go to the tunnels of Coochie and see all the booby traps and go down in the tunnels. They got lights and everything down there now. So, tools of the trade. That's your one of the types of pistols, the flashlight, and the knife. Not to mention the intense heat, which the lack of air underground, especially when the tunnels are too narrow for their movements, made their job more difficult. In the end, they suffered quite casualty rates also. A lot of tunnel rats went in and didn't come out. Quite often, they would have a rope tied around their leg or whatever, so if something happened, they could pull his body out. But as you see a tunnel rat going in, as you see there. The tunnel entrances were so well camouflaged that even the VCs sometimes would need an experienced guide to follow them. If you were from out of town, the Viet Cong, coming down the trail, and you were assigned to that unit, the first time you went to that tunnel, someone had to take it because you wouldn't be able to find it. In some cases, the last VC to enter the tunnels would set explosives around the entrance so the tunnel rat who tried to follow would be blown up. The last man. At the same time, the blast would cause the entrance to collapse, sealing the entrance. This would allow the Viet Cong to escape through other passageways and exits. Going down a tunnel system was a very risky business, fraught with danger, usually armed with a pistol and knife and a flashlight. The tunnel rat would descend into pitch black, claustrophobic, dank hell to play a deadly game of hide and seek with the enemy. And I imagine the humidity down in there, it was worse than it was upstairs, and it was bad upstairs. No airflow whatsoever. It's amazing. Carefully probing the floor, sides, and roofs of the tunnels, the tunnel rats, as he gently inched along and probed his way along, feeling for wires or tree roots that didn't quite feel right, knowing that any one of them could detonate a booby trap or blow into pieces. And if you just can't make out, he's crawling out, he's got his pistol in his hand, and looks like there might be some punji sticks there in front of him. It was a very stressful, nerve-wracking job. I think that's putting it mildly. Pushing the rat's mental state to its limits, crawling through narrow, pitch-black tunnels, sometimes for hours, looking for a heavily armed enemy who would, if he got a drop on you, not hesitate to kill you. Of course, you're going to do the same thing to him. Occasionally, under the strain, a man's nerves would break. He'd be dragged from the tunnel, screaming and crying. Once this happened, he would never be allowed down in the tunnels again. I believe I could stand up. If I got down in there, I'd just stand up. I don't know. It may be 3 or 4 feet, 5 feet on the ground, but I believe I'd stand up. I just can't imagine going down that tunnel like that. But you see the tunnel rat there with his flashlight and his pistol crawling through. And going down in tunnels posed a threat. Then coming up again could be just as dangerous. Upon emerging from a rat would often whistle Dixie. You've heard the old saying, just whistling Dixie? Just to let the troops on the surface know he was on their side. A little guy, stripped to the waist and covered in dirt, could easily be mistaken, particularly if he was an Oriental looking for a VC and shot by his own side. So he had to let him know he was coming up, and he was whistling Dixie. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers would volunteer to explore Viet Cong tunnels armed only with a flashlight and a .45. This young GI from the 1st Infantry Division was never seen again. Coochie, South Vietnam, 1966. As you can see, that tunnel's got water in it, and unfortunately, that young man never come out of the tunnels. Then the Americans decided, let's train some dogs. The Americans trained over 3,000 German shepherds to recognize the distinct smell of VC. The VC devised ingenious ways to conceal the tunnels from the Allies and their tunnel-sniffing German shepherds. The dogs were trained to sniff the air holes, smoke vents, and entrances. So the VC put hot chili peppers and garlic in these areas, so once the dog smelled it, it could destroy their nose and they would go away yelping. Or they would use American smells by planting an old piece of American uniform, soap, or aftershave near the holes, making the dogs think it was an American site. In other words, they come up with a way of confusing the dogs, which made the dogs almost quite often useless. As the dogs were only able to spot humans, not booby traps. Leaving the scent in the booby traps could disable the dog easily so that their handlers would be too horrified to continue to search and stop using the dogs. In other words, quite often the dogs would fall into the booby traps and be injured really bad or killed, and it's hard for the handler to keep using them. According to one historian, the tunnels had allowed the Viet Cong to so deeply infiltrate the Americans' Coochie base camp that at one time all 13 barbers on the base camp were Viet Cong. You can see the Ton Snoot, you can see the little arrow there. The yellow arrow was the tunnels of Coochie, and the red arrow was the Coochie base. It's hard to believe that the tunnels would come up into the base without being done, but then they hid things so well. 13 of the barbers were Coochie. In the early 1970s, the U.S. used B-52s to carpet bomb the whole area and destroyed most of the tunnel system. But that was the time when the U.S. withdrawal was about to withdraw from Vietnam. So in the 70s, we pulled out in 73. So when we pulled out, there was nobody destroying the drums. Today, part of the existing tunnels were reserved and enlarged for the tourist purposes. And if you go looking for pictures of the tunnels of Coochie today, most of the pictures are going to have two young girls in it like that. But there's a guide showing the pictures and the tunnel system. Now, I took a lot of pictures when I was at Coochie. I'm going to tell you, if you're a veteran and you go to the Coochie tunnels, I highly recommend it. But let me tell you before you go, there's a rifle range there. Nobody told us we had a rifle range there. So we're walking down through this nice big open jungle trail, and all of a sudden we started hearing 60 caliber machine guns going off. We started hearing AK-47s going off, and all of us together, 12 of us, and the thought that every one of us had at the same time was, what the hell? Then we discovered there was a shooting range. They weren't really shooting at us, and for $1.50, I think it is. It used to be $1. Now I think it's $1.50, $2. For a bullet, you can shoot a 60, you can shoot an AK-47, whatever. Like I said, it's a great tourist trap now. Now, we're going to talk about some new tunnels. That's the DMZ. As you can see down the arrow says, the yellow arrow says South Vietnam, and then you got North Vietnam. The DMZ was kind of a no man's land, which means anybody from either side was in that area, they were bad guys. Okay. The tunnels of Coochie are perhaps the best known of the tunnels complexes, but there was another large complex of tunnels found just north of the DMZ in North Vietnam. I've also been to these tunnels and took a lot of pictures, which I couldn't find. Okay. This kind of gives you an idea of this is the map of the tunnels and the different entrances and so forth. And most of it was written in Vietnamese, so I'm not going to bother to tell you what it is. But these tunnels here are right next to the ocean, and some of the tunnels open up to beautiful ocean views and so forth. Okay. The Vinh Moc tunnels, and you see the DMZ and some of the places, the Rock Pile, Camp Carroll, Quang Tri, some of the names you probably heard, Hamburger Hill, A Shaw Valley, but right next to the South China Sea, and right up at the top, you see the Vinh Moc tunnels. The Vinh Moc tunnels were built to shelter people from the intense bombing of Song Trong and Song Ha communes in Vinh Linh County of Quang Tri Province. Now, Quang Tri Province was the most heavily bombed area in history of warfare. Around the demilitarized zone. The American forces believed the villages of Vinh Moc were supplying food and armaments to the North Vietnamese garrison on the islands of Con Co, and does not show where the island was, which was in turn hindering the American bombers on their way to bomb Hanoi. So they felt like the people who in that village there were helping out the people who were on the island, which was also creating problems for the bombers. Okay. The idea was to force the village of Vinh Moc to leave the area, but as it is typical in Vietnam, there was nowhere for them to go. Now that's several pictures. This is the pictures of the tunnels today, but the tunnels were built bigger than the Coochie tunnels, and they did have lumber like that. And then in the tunnels, they have these ceramic type families there to kind of give you an idea of the tunnels. They had steps down and so forth. An entire town lived in these tunnels for 6 years. The villagers initially dug the tunnels to move their village 10 meters underground, but the American forces had bombs that could reach them at 10 meters. So the villagers moved the village to a depth of 30 meters. And again, they used the same tools, basically. The zone of Vinh Moc was bombed an average of 7 tons of bombs per each inhabitant. To flee the bombing and due to the favorable geology of the terrain, it was decided to begin excavating a complex of tunnels under the village of Vinh Moc in 1965. The complex of Vinh Moc tunnels were built on the shore of north of the Bien Hoa River. The construction sites, it took 13 months from 1965 to 1966, what is the same as 18,000 workdays of all persons in the village, which were used for its construction only with farming tools. You can see there. It has an estimated 300 people or 60 families live permanently in tunnels. Now, let's see, we said a while ago it was over 7,000 pounds, 300 people. That's about, that's a lot, okay. 60 families live permanently in tunnels during the years 1966 to 1972. 17 children were born in the interior of the Vinh Moc tunnels. The tunnels were extended 2.8 kilometers, divided into 3 different levels underground, 12 meters, 18 meters, and 22 meters deep. Okay, and then you see the family there. The top level was suitable for the life of the families. That was in small dwellings dug into the limestone rock of 4 meters wide, 8 meters, 8/10 of meters in height, and 1.8 meters wide. That's a family living in there. The second level was used to store the weapons and supplies in addition to maintaining strategic meeting areas. Now, they didn't have those lights that you see there in there then. The last and deepest tunnel was used to seek refuge from the bombing, since the American bombers were designed to penetrate 10 meters under the ground. Vinh Moc tunnels have a total of 13 gates. 7 of those doors gave sea and other 6 grounding. In other words, 7 of the doors or gates out of the tunnels, or into the tunnels, I guess, open up on water like this one. That's where one of the gates are right there by the water. The water outlets were used to transport weaponry and supplies to resistance in the island with Co, which is why we were bombing to start with, located 28 kilometers from the Viet Cong tunnels. With the passage of time, the tunnel complex was growing in size and complexity, reaching constructed wells, kitchens, barns, maternity wards, and hospitals for 17 children. The complex grew to include wells, kitchens, rooms for each family, and spaces for health care. Around 60 families again lived in the tunnels, and as many as 17 children were born inside the tunnels. The children would play by running back and forth through the tunnels, sometimes in almost complete darkness. I wonder what happened to their eyesight as they go up. Okay. Outside the area of the tunnels was dug 8 kilometers of trenches. In other words, if you were above ground, you get down in a trench during the bombing, which are still visible today, and they are. These trenches took 3 years to build. Now, this is a couple of pictures of families, illustrating families down in there. You had a lantern, but there's a family of 4 living in that little hole right there. The tunnels were a success, and no villagers lost their lives. The only direct hit was from a bomb that failed to explode. The resulting hole was utilized as a ventilation shaft. Now, I met a young man, or he wasn't a young man. I met a man who spent the 6 years. He was born in the tunnels and spent his first years in the 6 years. And he showed a great deal of signs of, I guess, post-traumatic stress, which the Vietnamese don't have, but he definitely was lacking in his mental capacity, which any of us would be if you spent 6 years down in a hole like that, been bombed every day. But I'll give you an example of how the families lived and so forth. Now, this is a story that I found about a young girl explaining her story there. Americans' bombs rain and overhead as Ho Thai Dru was born in an underground tunnel on January 1st, 1968, where hundreds of Vietnamese villagers carved out subterranean lives to escape the bloodshed of the country's brutal war. Salt water sloshed underfoot as her mother gave birth in the tunnel network in the communist area off coastal Quang Tri province just north of the military zone that separated North and South Vietnam during the war. And there's a picture of a baby being born and with salt water coming in. Okay. Jill and her mother spent the next 2 years living 15 meters, 49 feet below ground, alongside up to 600 people. Thousands of other villagers fled from the area. My mom told me it was difficult because we lacked so many things, from food to everyday supplies, said Ju, whose father was a Viet Cong fighter. But there's a family living in the tunnel. That he's a Viet Cong. You can see cleaning his rifle there, and not exactly the cleanest down in that dirt and so forth. But the villagers tried to chisel out normal lives, making space for classrooms and medical care, and even a common area where residents would gather to sing to drown out the noise of the bombs overhead. Ju was one of the 17 babies born in the tunnels, which also featured a 23-meter deep bomb shelters. But despite the occasional musical respite, life in the tunnels was often grim. And as you see, during operation, and I wouldn't think there was a lot of the sanitary facilities there were probably lacking a bit. My legs were always swollen and my vision suffered. Some men got scabies. That was regular during life in the tunnel, said Nguyen Tri Phung, who was just 14 years old when he joined some 250 locals to dig the 1 kilometer long network. Personal hygiene was non-existent. Residents struggled to wash their clothes and dispose of human waste, said Phung, a former Viet Cong fighter who guarded the tunnels during the war. And this is it's a relief outside the tunnels there of the tunnels and depicting the lifestyle and the people there. That is also a great trip if you go to Vietnam to see these tunnels. Not quite the tunnels of Coochie, but it was for a different purpose. Coochie was for combat. This is for raising their families and so forth. But the six different 6 years they were down in those holes. You saw 49 feet underground. Can't imagine living 49 feet underground, no air. Just going to the bathroom would be a challenge there. So that's the two of the tunnels that there. I highly recommend you do some more research on your own. The tunnels of Coochie. And I never knew about the tunnels at the DMZ until I was taken there and to see it, and a beautiful surrounding there at the DMZ, which now has the communist flag flying. Our next show, believe it or not, will be in December. What happened in November? December 12th. 12 days of Christmas. Is that what December 12th, and we right now we're scheduled to have a guest. His name is Howard Patrick. He wrote a book and lived the book, and the book is called A Never-Ending Battle, A Soldier's Ongoing Battle with the Combat PTSD. And once we do the show, I believe I can get him to put a link to Amazon where you can download the book for free and read the book. But he is a very nice gentleman. I've talked to him on the phone, and he's going to be our next one. And I did have a guest coming in for the show after that, but I just got an email from him before I came today. He's going to be in Washington, D.C., and we're not going to get back in time. So what I'm thinking about is the nuclear situation during the Vietnam War. There was an American general that had ordered some nuclear weapons to be delivered to Vietnam. So we're going to talk about the nuclear bombs in the Vietnam War on that show, which will be right after Christmas. I think it's only a day or two after Christmas. So I'm looking forward to seeing you just before Christmas. And like I said, if you have any questions or suggestions or whatever, give me a call, send me an email or whatever. Would like to have more input from you and what you'd like to see. There is a website out there. I think I mentioned it before. It's Vietnam Veterans for the Truth. If you have a question about anything that someone tells you about Vietnam, go to this website. I know some of the people that run this site, and look it up. There's a lot of wannabes out there all the time. Those are people who never went to Vietnam, who now claim to be Vietnam veterans. Sometimes you can't imagine how many medals they've got on their jacket and so forth. I don't know how they even walk with it and claim to be Vietnam veterans. As I mentioned before, the last census listed 13 million Vietnam veterans alive. And the thing about it was less than 3 million of us who served in Vietnam were very unique, bunch of men, and most of the ones I know are very unique and so forth. But again, thank you for tuning in. If you have questions or whatever, be sure to let us know. And Nissan Communication, Amnon has lots of different shows during the week. Tune in to some of the other shows and but tune into some of the other shows, and also I have Halfheimers here. Amnon Keeps Me Straight. This coming Saturday, if you're in the Triangle area, any place, the North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated. I thought it was the second. Is it the first? Okay. Well, I've been corrected again. At the state capitol grounds is the fantastic last firefight Vietnam Memorial there, and there will be the reading of the names of the 38 from North Carolina who's still missing from that. And then on December the 16th, there will be a candle lighting service at 6 o'clock in the evening. Now, the calling out of the names is at 12 o'clock noon. Be there at 12 o'clock or you'll miss it. Also, but on the 16th will be a candlelight service there, and that starts at 6 o'clock in the evening. So I know you want to, I highly recommend going to the candlelight service. It's very moving. So is the one there. But that's 2 opportunities to get some more, participate and get some more of the Vietnam experience out there. So have a good evening and looking forward to seeing you on the 12th.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.